Okay, well, welcome to this one-off special edition, a list-specific Madaxeman.com podcast. And I'm delighted to welcome Richard Case from somewhere that under current lockdown may as well be the other side of the world, but I think is probably about 15 miles as the crow flies, somewhere north of London from where we're sat here. And in this one, we're going to talk about a really popular list, probably more popular because it's got really cool hats than anything else, but the New Kingdom Egyptians. One of those lists that's in many ancient rule sets has flattered to deceive, I think it's fair to say. And I suspect one that, again, like many of the biblical lists, really works probably only in period, but as one I've used on many occasions and kind of struggled to pull together. But so I thought I'd get Richard on and his list building skills and put his list building brain to good effect, hopefully, to look at how we might assemble various different ways of putting together the New Kingdom Egyptian list. So, so Richard, welcome. How are you doing at the moment? Are you doing a lot of painting in this world of lockdown?
Yes, Tim, thank you. Doing well, and more painting per week than any time I can remember since teenagerdom, I think. So, it's an ill wind that blows no good. Obviously, sad times for many, but let's
good times for paint and paintbrush manufacturers.
Yeah,
good times for paint and paintbrush manufacturers. So the New Kingdom, I think when I pinged this at you, you'd said it's a list that you sort of skimmed over but never really looked at. What's your kind of history with it, if so to speak?
Yeah, so it's a list, or it's an army that I've often wanted to play. But unlike many biblical periods, as you said earlier, the hats are very distinctive, and therefore it's hard to substitute other forces. And a lot of my biblical periods are more Assyrian or Syrian or Ugarit or those kind of things. But I've played against a number of New Kingdom Egyptians, and I think it is a very interesting list, but obviously it is on the early side of biblical, and therefore it can suffer even in an all-biblical competition against some of the later period armies, which tend to have the heavy chariots, which in ADLG are treated as knights. So my first thought when I looked at it was, okay, well, I've really got to start with some thoughts about how can I make this army distinctive? Because what it doesn't have in large part is a lot of quick win troops. It doesn't have the knights. It doesn't have elephants. It doesn't have heavy chariots. It doesn't have those kind of breakthrough troops. So, and while it has the famous chariots, these are all treated as medium cavalry. In effect, they have no armor, so they're quite vulnerable to foot bows. And only a limited number of them can be elite to offset that.
And
So,
I think medium cavalry, we're all 4 or 5 years into ADLG now, and I think for that initial part of the meta, medium cavalry were the toxic troop type, really, weren't they? They were seen as junk. But I think there's been a growing awareness that in volume and in the right circumstance, and certainly if they're elite and if they can shoot, there actually is a role for them in kind of that ongoing paper scissors stone. But I think you nailed quite an interesting point there. Their nemesis is actually footbow. In a lot of ways, and that's a troop type you don't see in many other periods, but in the biblical period a lot of armies do actually have a lot of them, so you get to a strange point at which the medium cavalry chariots potentially could be good, but in this particular era their nemesis appears in quite serious numbers as well, so that's a weird challenge.
So what I did was draw a bit on my experience with the Palmyrans. Okay. Where I quite often use a command which is mainly medium cavalry bow, foot bow, and perhaps a few light horse bow, because you can somewhat support your light chariots, if you have your own bowmen up close to them, it adds to the mass of fire, and also means that if your own chariots are outnumbered, they have something to withdraw on. I think the other important thing is the Assyrians obviously have a high command score, but otherwise I think the Egyptians are one of the highest command score. And I think therefore, if it's an army where you've got a lot of sort of useful troops, but no real killer troops, then what's important is maneuver. And so I think it's very...
Well, yeah, +5 with a strategist is enormous by any category. That's getting you into Genghis Khan territory, isn't it?
Exactly. So, and whereas a lot of the other armies that have that option, like some of the Romans and so on, because they have all the armored and elite troops, they become very expensive. And so you often don't end up using all the command points. My approach with this Egyptian army, I've done 3 versions, has in every case to use either 4 or 5 command points to go for the strategist. And so you're essentially sort of doing the sort of Hannibal style formations where you are having some volume in the center, not necessarily wonderful quality, but some volume that will sort of fix your opponent, and then 2 maneuverable wings under brilliant generals or strategists, and hope to be able to use the combination of maneuver and firepower to take the enemy's wings and then Pac-Man in towards the center before your own center is destroyed by the enemy.
So that's, by the looks of it, it almost inevitably will be.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. The other advantage though is if you have drilled troops, even if you're facing enemy heavy chariots, if you move 3 and they move 3, you can always walk away.
True. Yeah, you can withdraw, do that Hannibal thing.
Exactly. And your opponent, you know, doesn't like to stick his heavy chariots too far into the jaws of a trap. So again, you can trade time for space in the old military manner.
Okay. All right. Well, look, should we dive straight into the list then and talk us through? So if we kind of pop this one up on screen, I'm looking at the first list here, standard list A, I think you've called it, and I can see, well, straight away you've got initiative of 3, which in a period in which almost nobody's going to have more than 2 light horse, that is a big old number. You know, most other people are wheeling in with 1 or 2 at best.
Correct.
And you've gone obviously 3 commands, that competent guy in the center and brilliant, and then strategist on either side, with what looks like 2, but actually literally 2 identical commands. So actually, yeah, I presume there's no logic in the strategist commanding one and the other. It's just whacking those extra command points somewhere.
Well, the only small logic is that the strategist has the light infantry javelins, who are more likely to get into combat, and therefore I might have to do more rallies. Okay. So that was, I had to pick one or the other. It's a minor factor, but you know, in the absence of anything else, that's why I count.
Okay. So both of your flank commands, you've got 2 light chariot bow, you've got 3 warriors, the medium swordsman impact, which is not a bad troop type at all. A couple of bowmen and then 2 skirmishing light infantry. So my first impression of that is, for something with maneuver, you've not upgraded the chariots to elite, and there's kind of only 2 of them, and there's 3 of the swordsmen. I might have looked at that and thought perhaps those ratios would have been the other way around, and that temptation to take the light chariots. Do you see the light chariots actually doing anything other than invading here, given they're not elite? Would you see them fighting? Or
yes, but and we'll look through at some of the other versions where I use the chariots in a different way. But here, essentially, you've got to look at the army as a whole, and effectively, what you're aiming to win with is the 9 medium swordsman, 8 impact and 1 two-handed weapon.
Because yeah, there's 3 in that central command as well. Okay.
Yeah. And so everything else is about fire support.
Right.
So the bowmen and the light chariots are there to soften up the enemy so that the medium impact foot can get in and do the damage. But the light chariots are also there to be thrown out wide and threaten to turn a flank. So that then forces your opponent to perhaps, enfilade back his flank to avoid being outflanked. And again, the light infantry are there to screen the warriors on the way in, and then hopefully stick on the side and provide overlaps once you get into hand to hand.
Yeah, because you've got 6 screening light infantry, which is that's a big number, particularly when it's sat in front of 9 warriors. You're covering almost all the frontage there, aren't you? So
Exactly.
you're definitely anticipating bow fire or those mixed bow sword units that the Assyrians and other people get, and just get medium swordsman impact in and do them over with that one kind of quickly. But does that not give you a kind of a tension between, if you're trying to go wide on the flanks, but you've got a troop type that needs to get in there as quickly as possible? Do you see kind of a struggle in balancing the width and maneuver piece with, I just want my medium swordsman impact in combat as quickly as possible before someone trips them up? Is that
to some degree? But that's the reason for having all the light foot and the bowmen, because there's 6 bowmen and 4 light chariots, so that's 10 elements of shooting, plus then there's 6 light infantry. So potentially you've got 16 elements firing. So the idea is that you to some degree you bring up the firing line, you start annoying the enemy, you see where you have success in weaken him, you use your hopefully superior command to out rally, and then you've got the maneuver to actually concentrate the center medium swordsman either to the left or to the right to support one of the wings, and then go in.
So yes, I suppose in a period where there's a lot of shooting, but people may be a bit reluctant to go in, or some of these troop types, the mixed troop types, they can't go in. Actually, the rallying capability, which is sort of always a kind of nice to have, but an afterthought, it's actually part of the design of this army.
Yes.
Okay, so you actually want a bit of a shooting exchange, and you want to out rally people, and you're happy for your bowmen and chariots and things to take and absorb some hits, because if that's a trade-off and you come out of that slightly ahead, then the impact swordsmen go in, and suddenly that's a very different game.
Correct, because a wounded bowman can still provide handy overlap or can still threaten the flank.
Okay, and then your central thing, I guess you had to put the medium swordsman heavy two-handed weapon somewhere. Were you tempted to, given this is the hold in the middle command, give them a bit more resilience by trying to squeeze some of the heavy guardsmen in there, or was this just the maneuverability still won?
The maneuverability still won. What I find is, I love heavy foot, but I find if you only have 1 or 2, they tend to slow everything down for only a minor improvement in the army's cohesion. So I really don't like using less than 4 in a command. I will occasionally, but normally, so the fact that only 2, I think, could be heavy tended to push me away from that.
From using it at all. Okay.
And again, I've gone for size a bit, because a lot of these are quite reasonable troops, but there's no elites in this version, and so what you get from that is quite a long fighting line.
Yeah, I think getting up to 26 units, that's a serious number. You're getting into the ranges of 28, which is enormous, and the trade-off with no elites, but you spent all the points on command. You've got 10, 13, you've got 19 points invested in command as well, which is, that makes 26 units quite impressive. But in this one, would you see those 3 warriors in the middle? Do you actually see this as kind of 3 separate groups of swordsmen, or would it be one of those where you butt the commands up against each other and you're you're effectively creating a block of 6 swordsmen somewhere after deployment with operating 2 of these commands together. Is that the aim always be to try and do that, or?
I would often try and do that, but I think not necessarily at deployment. The advantage of them being those clusters being quite small and having good command is that you should be able to move them a fair bit.
Okay.
So it is going to hugely depend on what you're facing.
Mm.
Is it an in-period army, and if so, is it the Elamites or is it the Assyrians? If you're facing an opponent with lots of heavy foot or lots of knights, then you're not going to want to be too adventurous.
Yeah. So is this one where the skirmish screen starts at the real forward extent, but you'd actually almost start with the medium swordsman possibly even a bit further back from their official start line, so they could get more lateral movement before they get up to the line of scrimmage? Or
particularly if it's an open centre. If there's a lot of terrain in the centre, different story.
Yeah. Well, you're with your 3 initiative and the strategist, you're likely to have quite a lot of control over terrain. And you've got plain and desert, which I guess most of the biblical armies are similar to. There's the odd mountain there. I think it's a slightly odd question, but it always needs to be asked about defend and own the terrain, particularly with a strategist, where you want an open table, or attack and move first and start to pin the enemy. And I'm wondering if this is sort of a flexible respond and try and get the enemy to commit themselves army, whether you are actually considering defending with this one.
I think it would, again, depending on what you're facing. The more if your opponent is a pure open terrain type opponent, then I would be very tempted to do that. But the advantage of having the strategist is, even if you go for the maximum number of terrain pieces, you can still move 1 piece, which I quite like.
Yeah.
That option. But yeah, I think particularly with a lot of troops that will be happy in plantations or fields, then I might very well be tempted to defend.
And chuck a lot of terrain down, because you've still only got four chariots here, despite it being ostensibly a chariot army. Okay, well look, that's an interesting medium swordsman impact one, which is sort of similar to, but kind of different to the ways I put this together. It makes me look at my drawer full of Egyptians and wonder if all those swordsmen are more useful than I think, which is nice to see. Let's move on and have a look at list B, which you put up here, which we'll just so looking at this one. So you've got something that's ostensibly similar on the 2. We'll call it the 2 flank commands, but I'm not sure if they are that. You've still got 2 chariots. You bump the medium swordsman in each flank command up to 3. You've actually bumped the archers up to 3 as well. So those are now starting to be, and a couple of light infantry too. So you've now got quite a lot of troops. Both of those are 8 combat and shooting troops. That's wider than the 6 that you can command in one group. You're mixing foot and bow. So you've got 2 big multi-capable commands with that slightly magic figure of 3 bowmen in it, that starts to put out a lot of firepower, but also starts to be a bit of a target. And then in the middle, or in the middle in this spreadsheet anyway, you've got a simple entirely mounted command with just 4 chariots, 3 of which are elite. You've got an included general. So given you've got an included general, you've got 3 elite chariots, I'm sort of looking at that going, is this actually going to fight somebody? And then your other one. So yeah, what is this? Is this refused center? Is this weighted wing? How does this one work?
So again, it would be opponent and terrain dependent, but the default would be, if you look statistically at the dice that allocate terrain, we all know that terrain is more likely to end up on the flanks of the flank sector rather than in the middle. So that's why it's set out in this order. So the default would be, you know, 2 clumps of medium foot on both wings in hopefully large bits of terrain, and then 8 chariots holding the open, 2 from the flank commands and 4 from the center, able to cooperate with each other. Again, the ability to perhaps refuse the center, but threaten anybody trying to attack the center by the flank chariots coming in against them. If, however, the terrain falls otherwise, and you have an open flank and you have more terrain in the center, then that 4 chariot command would probably be thrown out. It's also of a nice size to be completely hidden in a plantation, to leap out. It's also of a nice size to be a flank march, because you still have 20 units on table. So it gives you a lot of flexibility depending on what opponent and what terrain you end up facing. And I think that's what goes into a lot of my list design, is maintaining optionality. You know, you don't want to only have to play the army one way, because your opponent will then only have to solve one tactical problem. You want to be giving your opponent multiple tactical problems, so that if he fixes one, he actually perhaps opens himself up to another one.
So is this one, you know, it sounds, you've described different ways in which the terrain would fall, but compared to the first list, would you say you're probably more likely to go defend on this because you definitely want a lot of terrain down with it, and you want to create that one open space? No, I'm struggling to see.
I would actually say the opposite. I would actually say the opposite, because the other one has medium foot in all the commands, and so you really want a smattering of terrain right across. This one, because you can have the 8 chariots in the center, all you really want to be sure is that you've got hopefully at least one good terrain piece on each flank. And you also, because of the number of bow chariots, I mean, if you think your opponent is going to have a lot more, then it's a bit different. But what I would be looking to do would be to move first, to bring those chariots up aggressively to take control of the majority of the table, and then bring the infantry up steadily. You know, the advantage of the infantry is, you know, you can have them 6 wide with the light foot screening the impact foot. So you've only got 2 movement groups. And with a brilliant general and a strategist, you're always going to be able to move them both. And sometimes often you'll be able to double move them both.
Yeah.
So
they go quick, aren't they?
Yeah.
How are you deploying those? You know, is there a standard or a default way of deploying all those 6 foot? Is it, you know, are you looking at doing some weird interpenetration thing, which I can't even remember if it's actually legal? I might be talking rubbish there.
It depends. I mean, normally with medium foot, I would concentrate the 3 bowmen and the 3 impact swordsmen.
No, but would you deploy them in a line, or would you expect to expand them out nearer the enemy?
No, for preference, I would have them in a line of 6, and I would normally, the default would be, I would hope to have at least 1 plantation in a way, so that you can actually deploy them closer to the wing.
Okay.
But the norm would be to have the impact swordsman interestingly on the outside, so that the bowmen can fire support for the chariots.
Okay. So you're relying on the 3. So that strategy is giving you the extra ambush marker is a real key part. The ambush marker is a key part of the game. The moving terrain's a key part of the game, as well as the command and control. You're using all 3 aspects of the strategist to benefit.
And I think that's why, again, it's one of the things about this list, because you look at it initially and you think, well, there's not a lot of material to work with here. What really stands out for me is the command. The fact that you can have a strategist that you can actually afford all the command and still have a decent sized army and not be having a lot of unreliable commanders. So it's very much an army that is going to win or lose on the strength of its command and control rather than the simple quality of its troops.
Okay. Well, obviously those pharaohs were onto a good thing when they decided to be god kings, weren't they? That gives them that sort of extra thing. Well, look, let's kind of move on and then look at the third and final list of this. This means war.
This is a little bit similar to the first one. There's a kind of a mix of them both, really.
Yeah.
So this is taking a different approach again. It's so the third command is a bit typical of the previous ones. I've foregone the
skirmishers,
the skirmishers in order to have a bit more punch.
And you've got more four swordsmen and two archers and a couple of chariots down the bottom end.
Yeah. But the big difference is the first command, where I've gone for the 6 impetuous medium swordsmen, again screened by this time quite a lot of light infantry with the strategist so that he can hold them if I don't like the opponent. But, you know,
that's a lot of command firepower to, you know, that almost is suggesting that you're anticipating breaking those impetuous swordsmen up into 2 groups, because, you know, even a brilliant general can hold those well. But then there's perhaps where else would the strategist have been better with, or an option with that third command and flip a brilliant in? But
it definitely would. What I quite like about the strategist, though, is that it means you can hold impetuous troops and still do other things.
Sure. Okay.
And quite often you want to, you want to move a light infantry, you want to move 1 swordsman, because, you know, what that command doesn't have is 1 impact swordsman. So, you know, and that's another option, is to drop the strategist, have 2 brilliant generals and change one of those impetuous swordsmen into an impact swordsman. So you've got 1 more controllable foot type with it.
Yeah, because the impact swordsman is only an extra point, isn't it? You know, to have 5 impetuous and 1 impact.
Yeah,
would just give you a little bit extra, but you'd have to shave something off somewhere, I guess.
Yeah, you could get that by switching the strategist and the competent general for 2 brilliants.
Yeah, or possibly even then you lose the strategist. Maybe you could drop one of the 2-horse chariots down from elite to average, make in that center command, make them 3 and 3. That give you another couple of points. Okay, all right. So you know, and I guess any command that's got 6 impetuous medium swordsmen, that's doing what that does, isn't it?
Exactly.
Do you see this, though? You know, the rest of it, I'm saying that's what it does, but do you see this as this is actually the one that just hurls forward and suffers attrition and pins the enemy, and then the others do something? Or would you even see this one being held back a little in some situations?
I think a lot depends on the terrain. You know, this is one I might defend with, because it would be one I would be really hoping to get a plantation or a hill in the right position, so that I could spring those impetuous swordsmen from ambush.
Actually, yeah, because it's a couple of ambush markers holding those would be quite interesting, wouldn't it? It would give someone quite a problem.
It would, and I think that's often where, you know, impetuous troops can be most useful. One of the reasons for taking them is, in the biblical period, quite a lot of armies have medium spear, and so they can be particularly effective against medium spear, because, you know, if you win that first round, then your opponent's already lost 2 or maybe all 3.
Yeah, you can knock the whole straight through.
Cohesion, and so your chance of getting breakthroughs is pretty high. I think this is I think this is a list that I'd be more likely to take in a 2-list competition than a 1-list competition, because I think by and large, the Impetuous can be a bit risky in a single list competition if you've always got to use them.
Yeah, I think they're risky, and also in a single list competition, they do force you down one particular style of play. So if it's more than 5 games, like I think campaign, you can end up almost playing the same game because the Impetuous drag you so far down a one particular strategy or play style or whatever.
Yes, but what's interesting is if you look at it, this army in this version then has a lot of similarity in a way to a patrician Roman army.
True.
High command points, some impetuous troops, a little bit of good mounted, some capable medium swordsman impact. So you could create something quite similar. So that would be the kind of way I would imagine it, and a bit the same historically. This is an army perhaps from the later part of the New Kingdom Egyptian, when you're starting to get more impact of the Sea Peoples coming in. So if you're the sort of player who likes to play historical things, that's something to bear in mind.
Yeah. But that second command, looking at that, so once I'm looking at that going, there's 4 elite light chariots, let's call them shooting medium cavalry, and another 2 normal ones. Now 6 cavalry, of which 4 are elite, even accepting the fact they're mediums and they all shoot, that to me, and maybe this is just how I approach games in a slightly cavalier fashion, that's looking like something that would actually be prepared to fight.
Definitely.
You would stand up, even if you were facing somebody who'd split their 4 heavy chariots into 2, with a bit of shooting, you'd almost be prepared to have a go, because you can beat the support troops and hang on a bit against them. Yeah.
If you made the important point, though, if you've already got a hit, because the challenge is if you're facing a heavy chariot impact, at initial contact, they're 3 to your 1.
Yeah.
And if they're elite as well, that can get ugly.
Yeah, that's pretty painful. I'm just trying to
remember. Then it's a different question.
Just trying to remember, can light chariots fire out the rear? Is that
they can at a -1?
At a -1, okay. So you could. Yeah, I suppose that's an interesting future rules amendment question, isn't it? Whether that would give them a little extra boost if they could fire out the rear backwards, or whether then they just suddenly become too easy to use to retreat in front of heavy chariots.
You can use them that way now, but the -1 against heavy chariots, particularly if the chariots are elite, you don't tend to do that. But
exactly, makes it entirely pointless, doesn't it? Yeah.
But where it's quite useful is if you have to flee, and then your opponent moves other troops up, not quite close enough to catch you, but enough to stop you maybe multi-moving.
Yeah.
Then often you can actually have a shot at him. Okay. And with 6, you're going
to get lucky, aren't you? You're going to get lucky.
You may get lucky. You may have 1 or 2 where you're doubling up or tripling up, and it just makes your opponent think twice. Compared, it's the one advantage the chariots have over medium cavalry.
Okay, so then your final command here is your textbook 4 medium swordsman impact, a couple of bowmen, and a couple of chariots. This is the one that does the Swiss Army knife stuff that the other 2 with mono mission don't necessarily do.
Correct.
And this has been pretty consistent throughout all 3 of these lists then. Okay.
Yeah, and depending on the table, that's probably going to be on a flank, but the other 2, if there's terrain in the middle, I'll almost certainly put the impetuous swordsman in the middle. If there's no terrain in the middle, the chariots will be in the middle. You in those commands, I've always gone for 6 battle troops, battle foot troops, so that they can be moved for 1 command point. And 4 impact swordsmen and 2 bowmen is going to make, in period, is going to make everything except heavy chariots think twice.
Yeah. No, I've tried using the Sargonid Assyrian with just non-impact swordsmen, and they really are underpowered once they come up against anything like this. And I think even my other army being the Mycenaeans with solid spearmen, I think there's an argument that that might be one of the few armies that needs to use a lot of rear support, because in period there's a lot of things that can cause them trouble, and that extra point on rear support can sometimes neutralize it. But
absolutely,
which is an intriguing one. I think it's interesting. I used this list in a competition at campaign. So before we kind of wrap up, I'll quickly, if we've still got time, flip on to a different, the actual list that I used down at campaign.
This means war.
And this was a really, as campaign is, a really, really tightly themed period. And I actually ended up, I think out of 6 games, I ended up playing 5 other New Kingdom Egyptian armies, because there's only sort of 4 or 5 allowed. And I think for this one, as I've said, very, very different to yours, but in the context of a super tight theme. I think the only proper, there was no real heavy chariot armies here, and the only kind of mounted army was the Bedouin, with all those medium camels who shoot. So a lot of the games ended up much more a straightforward attack. So slightly oddly, I'd really gone big on the impact foot, partly I guess because I was anticipating the other New Kingdom armies would gravitate towards those regular infantry, and I just wanted that first round. Okay, sometimes you're down because the way the impetuosity works, but then the doubling up of hits can mean you get lucky. It also meant with Costa Coffee and other places quite near, I could get a coffee quite early because the game's ended soon. But this was a real in-your-face kind of attack you on all 3 things with a load of foot. So I was starting with 4 of the Impetuous warriors as a solid block, and a 2-handed cutting weapon medium foot. So that was effectively a block of 5 combat troops. Couple of infantry to screen them, 2 to screen them, 2 mediocre bowmen that with 5 of these things getting in your face, they weren't going to get to do much shooting. The army was going forward, so they were a bit of padding, but working with a chariot, they were sort of there to drive off light foot and kind of sit in a bit of terrain and not lose things whilst they were just, the army's a delivery mechanism for those 5. The next one was my kind of go to, join up the other 2 command, and I did actually go for the heavy infantry because I felt in period 2 isn't really enough. It's absolutely right, but I just, well, actually maybe it's easier to look at the 3rd command. The 3rd command was pretty much a reflection of the front one, but with even less support troops. 5 more Sheridan Impetuous, another 2-handed cutting weapon, a couple of bits to do it. So this again was a delivery mechanism. I'm putting 10 either 2-handed cutting or Impetuous swordsmen down someone's throat, and then this middle command in that context really was protecting the one flank that I couldn't protect with the edge of the table or waterway, with something that just would be super tough. And I absolutely agree with what you're saying about heavy infantry being slowing things down and much better in bigger blocks. But in a period when there were a lot of light chariots, I just felt that extra resilience that they had would really offset the slowness of the maneuvering, particularly as the rest of my army was very one-dimensional and kind of was executing one plan. So I thought, stick them in there and they will just take longer to erode, even if they're losing, even if they're outnumbered, than the rest of the army will take to either win or lose. And then 3 chariots and the optional light horse guy there to just occupy space with this one. So I guess I anticipated the light chariots falling back, the medium spear probably dying somewhere or possibly standing in the open and making my 3 chariots kind of 5 wide against someone else's chariots, and the heavy infantry just hanging on whilst the rest of the army did what it needed to do, and hopefully 10 swordsmen, 200 cutters, Impetuous guys would would find their way into and through some other people's bowmen and their normal medium foot swordsmen before it worked. So, but this was, you know, very, very different way of doing it to yours, not relying on command and control at all, almost the opposite way, relying on an army that will just roll forwards and do its own thing under its own steam, but in the context of a really, really tightly themed competition. And I think all those different battle reports are up on the website from campaign last year, and in that context it worked quite well. You know, and it's been interesting in the back of my mind looking at your list and thinking, would they have worked in that context against some of these other big, you know, an army like this that's just going, okay, you're trying to be clever with 9 of them, I'm trying to not be clever with 10 of them. Does that match up, and whether the flexibility would have outweighed the simple mindedness of it. Interesting balance.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, as long as you have a plan, it's fine. I think that's the thing with all these lists. There's, you know, I was listening to on one of your other podcasts, I think it was the Tang discussion. And I think every version that people had come up with was different, and they were all playable because they all had an ethos of how they were going to be used. And I think the key is, how do you like to play? You know, do you like to line them up and charge? Do you like to fence? Do you like to shoot? Do you like a bit of all of it? And bear that in mind when you design your list, and remember it when you play with it.
And you remember when you play, which is always the challenge as well. No, I think that's the, you know, that's the good catch actually. And I think what's been really interesting about this is, you know, I've looked at this because it's an army I've got the figures for ages ago. They were the Gladiator Games ones. They're now the ones that are sold by Fighting 15s. And they're some of my kind of favorite biblical figures. And I did a rebasing project on them a couple of years ago, and they do look, you know, very, very nice. So I do like getting them on table, but I think it's very easy to look at a list with as few, you know, winning killer troops in it as this one, and as small enough minimums, and get sucked into the quality trap of going, right, I've got to max out on the elite chariots, and I've got to max out on the elite foot. And actually, I think all of the variants that we've looked at, they've focused on something, but it's not just grabbing for quality and then trying to hang a plan on the back of that. You know, you've grabbed onto command and control and maneuverability and flexibility, and this one grabs onto just raw punching power against in-period opponents, with the acceptance that sometimes that will come unstuck, but over the course of a, you know, 5-6 game competition, if you pre-guess the matchups, you can do well as well. But so I think there's some extra dimensions in this Egyptian list, and all of them are steering away from how many elites can I have, what else do I fit around it, which is quite of a non-immediate way of looking at the lists. But I just get the impression that starting with the elites and working backwards is probably how you end up making this into a list that flatters to deceive.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think that the times I tend to rely more on the elites is when it's an army that only has 2 or 3 command. And so, you know, eventually you're going to be in trouble, and you're going to be relying on armor or elites to help you hang on, rather than the quality of the generals. I think, given the preference, it makes for a more challenging game if you go for the command and the breadth of army rather than just relying on quality. But there are times when that's very useful, and like in this, you've got a judicious use of quality to strengthen your center, which can so often be important.
Well, look, I think that's been a really interesting discussion. I think I've learned something, and I think I'm looking at that list number 14 in a new light, and I'm looking at some of the troops that I've painted up and based, which were great in other rule sets, which I was struggling to find a home for in a different light as well, which is fantastic as well. So, look, Richard, thank you for that.
Pleasure.
We'll have to pick another list and reconvene and do this again. And there's now one of the benefits of lockdown is that there's now a regular series of these Madaxeman podcasts coming out. I think we should sneak this one out sometime in the next week or so, in between the weekly chit chat. Maybe we'll bring you in as a guest if you can escape your family on a Monday evening time and join in the pseudo pub banter. I think we've also got another 30-minute special coming out on the exciting subject of paintbrushes. Rock and roll. It's pretty wild out there. So look, thank you for joining us and chatting about this list. Hopefully we've imparted something to someone, if only 30-40 minutes of background chat that's not Spotify while they're doing painting. And we will catch up soon. So
excellent.
Thank you. Catch you soon. Thanks, Richard.
Cheers, bye.
Bye.